Chapter 5. Bullet watched the trout line rise up out of the dark water. The thick pieces of eel with which it was baited had white underbellies, so that up until nearly the surface, in the dim light, it looked like there was a crab on every piece. This was the first run, and most of the bait came up empty. He kept his net poised just above the surface of the water. He kept his eyes on the moving line. Behind him, Patrice ran the motor, holding the boat on course and on speed. One after the other, the chunks of bait thumped against the plastic roller. The big engine chugged away. Finally, a crab rose, holding on to the eel with one claw while ripping at it with the other. Bullet dipped, netted it, dumped it into the waiting basket. As he had expected, this crab was the vanguard for a cluster. He netted 3 in a row, one after the other, dropped them into the basket, and waited again. The surface of the water lay still, dull silver, a low flat wash of clouds covering the rising sun. The motor hummed. They were alone on the bay. No other professionals work Sundays, and the amateurs seemed to think that Labor Day marked the end for crabs as well as people. This was the way Bullet liked it best. They set the line out across the mouth of a creek and had everything the way they wanted it. As they progressed along the line's length, crabs appeared in bunches. Bullet got them on board into the basket. When they came to the end of the line, Patrice flicked the line free from the roller, turned the big boat in a broad circle, and headed back for another run. After the second run, Patrice shut down the motor. They had almost a full bushel. Not a bad showing, not a particularly good one. Most of the crabs in the basket had settled down, but the newest ones still moved restlessly, snapping their pincers at each other, establishing their territory on the pile of crabs. Their beady eyes barely showed up against the grimy blue of their shells. Some had foamy spittle coming out of their mouths, blown out in impersonal hostility. They waved their claws up in the air, threatening. Bullet put the lid on top of the basket. A couple of swimmer claws stuck out between the vertical slats. We will have started too early, I think, Patrice said. Bullet leaned back against the gunwales and nodded at his employer. Patrice had short, tightly curled hair, graying irregularly. He wore, as always, khaki trousers, heavy work boots, and no shirt. His face and torso were tanned a permanent deep brown. Even his pot-belly, swelling out over his belt, shone brown. He was a couple of inches shorter than Bullet, and barrel-chested, with big muscles in his shoulders and arms. He had about the ugliest face Bullet had ever seen, little dark eyes and a short nose, big flat teeth and skin marked with deep lines. "Well, so we have erred," Patrice said cheerfully. Nothing bothered him. In the more than 4 years Bullet had been working for him, he'd never seen Patrice bothered, not by people, not by weather, not by bad luck or good luck. "That makes it a good time to eat. I'll put on the water for the coffee." Before he went up to the little 3-sided cabin near the bow of the long workboat, he leaned over the side to call up the opaque water of the creek. "Crabs awake! Arise! Breakfast is now being served. Good! Salted eel marinated in the rich brine. Come to the table, crabs!" Bullet had baited that line. It took 10 solid minutes of washing, first with salt and then with lemon, to get the smell off his hands. "They're not that stupid," he said. Patrice turned to look at him, squinting into the glare of the sun, which was emerging from a cloud cover. "You think not? See now, I give you an analogy. You are sitting at your dinner table. You are eating. Perhaps fried chicken, perhaps a beef stew with biscuits. You notice that your plate rises from the table. Slowly, it rises up, through an open window, toward the top of the sky. Do you then hold tightly to your plate so that you attend it, yourself rising to the sky? Do you then continue to eat, as you and your plate soar up, higher and still higher? No, I will tell you, you do not. You say to yourself, 'Bullet, old friend, something is not right.' You let go of the plate, and do you know why you act so? Because you are smart." "Nope," Bullet said, shaking his head, grinning. "It's because I'm not a crab, because my instinct for self-preservation is stronger than my instinct to feed." Patrice studied him sadly. "I don't know why I waste myself on you. You have no speculative thought. I don't know why I hire you." "I do," Bullet answered, "because I work." Patrice went up to the cabin. Bullet rested against the gunwales, with the boat rocking gently under his feet as it drifted with the tide out toward the red road the sun made on the silver water. The temperature rose. It had taken him a while to figure out Patrice. In fact, the first time Patrice had offered him a permanent job, he had refused. Skippers who hired kids did it because they could give them much less of a take, and Bullet was just then 13. He didn't mind working for Patrice even then, but he'd learned how things were. Skippers thought they could bully kids around more, because kids were so glad of any kind of job. Kids got all the scut work, too. Not Bullet, though. He'd never go out more than once with a skipper who kept him busy cleaning up more than his fair share. He didn't mind being yelled at, up to a point, or blamed because the wind was up and the crabs weren't biting, or the engine broke down, up to a point. He'd learned, too, just how much talking back he could do, just how far he could go. He kind of enjoyed that, pushing a man just to the exact point, and then, when the guy was dying, to have you go one step further so he could really explode at you, stop. He always paced himself, too, in the work, how fast he'd move. These guys, all the guys on the crew, whoever they were, they thought that because they were bigger, older, stronger, in command, they could tell him everything and use him as a yelling board when something else went wrong on them. Patrice had made no sense to Bullet at first. He never got riled, and Bullet couldn't push him at all. He'd shrug things off. When he felt like talking, he'd talk. Bullet could listen or not, depending. When he talked, it wasn't the usual stuff, women or hard luck or boasting. He didn't ask questions either. He'd just start in about some place he'd been, or something he'd like to eat, or even some old story he'd thought of. Bullet figured at first that the guy was a little weird, and he steered clear. But after a while, he figured it out. Patrice had nothing to prove. Nothing to prove on Bullet, nothing to prove to him. He let Bullet be. So the second time, the summer between 7th and 8th grade, that Patrice asked him to work regularly, Bullet agreed. If nothing else, Patrice always did a fair split of the take, so Bullet could give him a fair day's work without getting cheated, whether he was a kid or not. Patrice worked him like a man, paid him like a man, treated him like a man, from the first. When Patrice came back, he carried a metal tray on which there were a tin coffee pot, 2 thick white mugs, a slab of butter, and a straw basket covered with a white cloth. Patrice ground his coffee beans the last thing before they left the dock, because the fresher the grind, the better the coffee. The crusty rolls under the cloth had been in the oven when Bullet arrived at 5 that morning. The missing fingers on Patrice's hand, which made it difficult for him to tie bait onto the line and tiring for him to net crabs, didn't impede him in the kitchen. They sat down facing one another, cross-legged on a wooden deck. Bullet's stomach felt howl with a hunger he hadn't felt until just then. He broke a roll apart with his hands and spread it with butter. Patrice poured coffee. Patrice was missing the thumb on his right hand and the first 2 joints on the index finger of his left hand. He'd never told Bullet how that happened, but Bullet assumed from the thick, callous stumps that it must have been long ago, and Patrice no longer remembered that he had lost anything. He never mentioned it, never had. "Good," Patrice said, swigging coffee. "Good," Bullet agreed, his mouth full of chewy white bread, the mug ready to hand. Patrice looked at him, his little eyes bright and clever. "Now that your scalp is tanned, you don't look so appalling." "Did I look appalling?" Bullet hadn't thought about it. "You didn't think so? You look like you were wearing a helmet, a leprous helmet. You look savage, a barbarian." The eyes studied him. "You still do." "I like it," Bullet said. He didn't think about what he was going to say to Patrice. He just said what he felt like. "How do you keep the growth down?" "Shave it every other day." "Troublesome, isn't it?" "Yeah, but it's worth it." "To annoy your father?" Patrice guessed. Bullet smiled. "Besides, what's wrong with being a barbarian?" "Of course, there's something splendid about that, and you do have a good head, my friend, well-shaped. But when you consider the centuries that have gone into civilizing of the world—" "Yeah, but has it worked?" Bullet asked. He drained the last of his coffee. "No, perhaps not. Oh, well." Patrice poured him another half cup and refilled his own. "But you are young, and there is hope for you yet." Bullet didn't answer. Patrice often teased him this way, and there wasn't anything he needed to say in answer. It was just the way Patrice got around to talking about something he wanted to talk about. You know, traditionally the barbarian has swept over the civilized world, Patrice said now. Goths or Visigoths or Ostrogoths and the Vandals and the Huns. Poor old Rome, like a kitchen floor, swept and swept, don't you think? The Archaeans of Troy, the Vikings along the coast of Ireland and England and France. Are there any barbarians left? Bullitt wondered. Patrice shrugged. Can a man tell about the history he lives in? The enemy is always the barbarian, just as God is always on my side. The blacks in Africa, perhaps they are. Come off it. Tall, strong, and splendid. Warrior races? You are thinking too narrowly. You must look out for that. Picture him, his dark skin gleaming, bare feet, and his body hung with jewelry made out of the bones of his prey. He moves through the long grass, a spear held high, only a skin shield to protect him. He stands before an elephant. If he kills the beast, he is a hero. If he dies, all a man asks is to die well, to die in good battle and bravely. He is a hero. You're prettying it up, Bullitt said. But of course, this is speculative thought. You ought to come to school and see what they're really like. If I did, I might not agree with you about what they're really like. And there's you. You're a barbarian, out of your time. But you will have trouble, being only one. It is hard for one to overrun. Bullitt guessed he knew what Patrice meant, and he didn't mind it. He'd always known how different he was, and he'd never minded. You're pleased, Patrice observed. I have paid you a compliment? The gnome face looked as though it wanted to laugh. You have, Bullitt told him. You know, you don't talk like you're uneducated. But why should I? I have been to school. I was even going to go on in school. What happened? Patrice shrugged. The Germans came. And? I no longer went to school. Finish your coffee and get on with your work. I'll save the last roll for you. Bullitt did as he was told. He never minded doing what Patrice told him. He'd learned that Patrice only told him what was necessary. Bullitt stood up to get the tongs. He lifted the lid of the basket and looked down at the quiet mass of crabs. He tongued out one and turned it over to see by the apron whether it was male or female. They sold females to the packing houses, the different sizes all jumbled in together. It was the jimmies, the males over 6 inches from point to point, that they were really after. But as long as a crab was of legal size, they could use it. This one was male, barely 5 inches, and he tossed it into the basket for the small males. Behind him, he heard Patrice move to stand in the small shaded rectangle made by the cabin. He knew how his employer would look, leaning against the cabin wall, a mug in his hand, his eyes watching Bullitt cull the catch. He'd always let Bullitt do the culling and never griped at any mistakes. A couple of times at first, Bullitt had tossed big jimmies overboard, watching them arc out over the water, listening for any sound from behind him that Patrice had seen the loss. Finally, getting no reaction, he had flipped one that must have been 7.5 inches, maybe even 8, really big. He'd waited to see what the explosion would be like, but he'd heard only a chuckle, and then Patrice had spoken behind him. I cannot bear to watch. You are on your own. Bullitt had turned around, angry at the laughter in the man's voice, but Patrice was already walking away to lift the cover up and take a look at the engine. Sometimes Bullitt wondered why Patrice had put up with him at first, but he never asked. He just kept coming to work, feeling himself ease up as soon as he stepped over the picket fence into Patrice's yard. He didn't mind Patrice, and Patrice didn't mind him. They did all right together. Bullitt worked fast, tonging, turning, tossing either into basket or overboard. The crabs were stirred up now, moving around over one another, spitting, clacking their claws. As he held each up, it swam with its legs in unresponsive air. He tonged in and sorted, ignoring the most aggressive ones for a while. These backed away from the tongs, pincers upraised, legs scurrying for footholds on the wet and moving mass beneath. He gave them time to settle down while he picked out another. Once they had settled down, folding their claws together, he picked out one quickly. They would take the jimmies down to the dock to sell by the bushel at whatever the day's price was. Buyers from the small crab houses all over the eastern shore came to the docks at about lunchtime. Patrice preferred to sell to them because he got a better price. At this time of year, however, he would probably have to sell to the wholesalers, and they would make less. Bullet bent to dip into the basket, straightened to toss the crab overboard, bent again to dip again. There was a rhythm to this job, governed by the movement of his arm, like scything through a field of hay. Beneath him, Patrice stood watching Bullet do the job right. Until the culling was done, they couldn't tell what the harvest of catch actually was. "Looks like a couple dozen," Bullet reported. "Not too terrific," he corroborated the expression on Patrice's face. Patrice handed him the roll, slathered with butter. Bullet bit into it, hungry again. "It is early days. We'll see how the runs go. Maybe it's time to start for oysters." "It's pretty warm still." "You prefer when we oyster in the winter?" Patrice raised his eyebrows. Bullet knew he was teasing. "Frankly, I prefer crabbing. Oystering is hard work." "It's all hard work. You're young and strong. I'm old and wily. Hard work doesn't hurt us." "I didn't say it did," Bullet pointed out. "No, you didn't," Patrice agreed. "Ready now?"